Hello, and thanks for joining us as we come to Lesson 26 in our study of the book of Jeremiah. Here we've come to the final lesson that deals with the final 3 chapters of what Jeremiah is writing about the nation of Babylon and what was going to be the consequences of her sinfulness and of her failure to serve the living God. In question 1 of Lesson 26, it says, "Who were some of the gods of Babylon, and what was their ultimate fate?" Well, here in Jeremiah chapter 50 and going to verse 2, it mentions a couple of the Babylonian gods. It says here in chapter 50 and going down to verse 2. Flip back over here. "Declare ye among the nations, and publish and set up a standard. Publish and conceal not. Say, Babylon is taken, Bel is confounded, Merodach is broken in pieces. Her idols are confounded, her images are broken in pieces." So Bel and Merodach are 2 of the idols that were worshipped by the Babylonians. But historians have unearthed something like 53 different temples that were located in the city of Babylon. And gods like Ishtar and Nimah and Nimnura and Gula and Marduk are all other gods that were worshipped by the Babylonians. In question 2, as Babylon falls, what did the people of Israel and Judah do, and what happens to them? Here in chapter 50, verses 4 and 5, it says, "In those days and in that time, saith the Lord, the children of Israel shall come, and they of the children of Judah together, going and weeping, and they shall go and seek the Lord their God. They shall ask the way to Zion with their faces thitherward, saying, Come, and let us join ourselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that shall not be forgotten." So here we find that as Babylon falls, the Israelites, the Jews, once again realize their sinfulness and their need to go back home, and they make plans to be able to go there. They turn to God, and they pledge a perpetual covenant to Him, and God promised to pardon them. Going down to verse 20 of this 50th chapter, "In those days and in that time, saith the Lord, the iniquity of Israel shall be sought for, and there shall be none, and the sins of Judah, and they shall not be found, for I will pardon them whom I reserve." So when God pardons sin, He forgets about it, and the sinfulness of Judah is going to be forgiven. In question 3, what had led Israel into captivity? Well, as we flip back to verses 6 and 7 here of Jeremiah chapter 50, it says in verse 6, "My people have been lost sheep. Their shepherds have caused them to go astray. They have turned them away on the mountains. They've gone from mountain to hill. They have forgotten their resting place. All that found them have devoured them, and their adversaries said, we offend not, because they have sinned against the Lord, the habitation of justice, even the Lord, the hope of their fathers." Israel had been led into captivity by their shepherds or their leaders. And once these corrupt leaders had led them down the wrong path, God did not continue to protect them. And others felt they were doing a righteous thing, as these adversaries were victorious over this sinful people. In question 4, who will cause destruction to come against Babylon, and how is this accomplished? Here in chapter 50 and verse 9, it says, "For lo, I will raise up and cause to come against Babylon an assembly of great nations from the north country, and they shall set themselves in array against her. From thence she shall be taken. Their arrows shall be of a mighty expert man, and none shall return in vain." The point that's made here is that the great nations of the north, the Medes and the Persians, are going to be the nations that sweep in and are going to one day be called upon to be the punishing hand against Babylon itself. In question 5, it says, what was the Babylonians' attitude when they attacked Israel? Well, here in chapter 50 and verse 11, it says, "Ye were glad, because ye rejoiced, O ye destroyers of mine heritage. because ye are grown fat as the heifer at grass, and bellow as bulls. It says you rejoiced in your victory over the Jews and in the destruction of their heritage. He said you were glad there in verse 11, and because of their arrogance they will suffer. In question 6, what other reasons are given for God's wrath against Babylon? And several verses are noted. In verse 14, it said, put yourselves in array against Babylon round about, all ye that bend the bow and shoot at her. Spare no arrows, for she has sinned against the Lord. Her iniquity is going to be such that God chooses one day to punish Babylon because of the iniquity found in her, the unrighteousness that was there. In verse 15, it says, shout against her round about. She hath given her hand, her foundations are fallen, her walls are thrown down, for it is the vengeance of the Lord. Take vengeance upon her, as she hath done, do unto her. This is going to be revenge time. Vengeance because of all of the nations that she crushed and destroyed. It now will be her turn to suffer the similar fate. In verse 24, it said, I've laid a snare for thee, and thou art also taken, O Babylon, and thou wast not aware. Thou art found and also caught, because thou hast striven against the Lord. Because you've rejected me and my ways, you are going to suffer accordingly. Also in verse 28, he says, the voice of them that flee and escape out of the land of Babylon, to declare in Zion the vengeance of the Lord our God, the vengeance of his temple. There would be vengeance because of the destroying of the house of the Lord that was done back in Jerusalem whenever the city fell. But in verse 29 we see something about their attitude. Call together the archers against Babylon, all ye that bend the bow, camp against it round about. Let none therefore escape. Recompense her according to her work, according to all that she hath done. Do unto her, for she hath been proud against the Lord and against the Holy One of Israel. Because she would not listen to the instruction given by men like Daniel and others, and became arrogant against the Lord, her pride figured into her destruction. And then, of course, in verse 38, reference is made to her idolatry. It says, and a drought is upon her waters, and they shall be dried up. For it is the land of graven images, and they are mad upon their idols. So their idolatry is not going to save them, and God will see them destroyed. In question 7, what does Jeremiah mean when he says that Babylon's day has come? That phrase is used several times in this 50th chapter. In verse 27, it says, slay all of her bullocks, let them go down to the slaughter. Woe unto them, for their day is come, the time of their visitation. The day of the Lord, as is talked about here, or their day that is come, is the day of the Lord's visitation of his wrath upon the nation of Babylon. In verse 31, behold, I am against thee, O thou most proud, saith the Lord, the God of hosts, for thy day is come, the time that I will visit thee. So this judgment day has come for them, and God's wrath is going to now be poured out upon Babylon. Now in question 8, when the Jordan River flooded the wooded area along the river, what was driven out of the area and came among the people? Here Jeremiah is using an image from their past. In verse 44, it says, behold, ye shall come up like a lion from the swelling of the Jordan unto the habitation of the strong. But I will make them suddenly run away from her, and who is a chosen man, that I may appoint over her. For who is like me, and who will appoint me the time? And who is that shepherd that will stand before me? He uses the imagery here of the lions that would come up from the Jordan River Valley and in amongst the people whenever the floodwaters drove them from their home. Well, there was going to be, as it were in an image, a savage beast that was going to ravage the Babylonians, and nobody would be able to thwart this power. In question 9, who is this lion that will attack and destroy Babylon? Well, they're even named here in verse 44. And moving over to let's go over to chapter 51 and going down to verse 11. It says, make bright the arrows and gather the shields. The Lord hath raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes. for his device is against Babylon to destroy it, because it is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance of his temple. Now at this point, Babylon is in control. It's destroying one nation after another. It is at the pinnacle of its power. No one's thinking about the Medes. What nation is that? But God is giving prophecy here as to who is going to be the instrument of his vengeance upon the Babylonians whenever the time is right. In question 10, what figures are used to illustrate God's use of Babylon against the nations facing his wrath? Here Jeremiah cites several metaphors, we might say, that are illustrations of God's using tools in his destructive process. In chapter 51, and going to verse 7, Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand, that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunk of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Here the idea of it being a cup of wine offered to these nations. Many of them were seduced by the Babylonians, thinking that they were safe people to have as friends. Remember when ambassadors from Babylon came to see Hezekiah, and he showed them all the wealth of his house? And the prophet rebuked him because one day it would be Babylon that would come and take that wealth away. In verse 20 of this 51st chapter, it says, Thou art my battle axe and weapons of war. For with thee I will break in pieces the nations, and with thee will I destroy kingdoms. So here the image of a battle axe is used as being God's instrument to destroy these various nations. And then in verse 25 of the 51st chapter, Behold, I am against thee, O destroying mountain, saith the Lord, which destroyest all the earth, and I will stretch out mine hand upon thee, and roll thee down from the rocks, and will make thee a burnt mountain. In this imagery, I kind of think of a volcano that erupts and destroys everything in its path, but then it becomes just a burnt mountain. And so we find that Babylon was used as a tool for a while to be able to exact vengeance upon the nations that God wanted punished, but eventually that wrath was going to blow back on them. In question 11, what are the people admonished to do at the time of Babylon's fall? In chapter 51 here, and going down to verse 6, he says, Flee out of the midst of Babylon, and deliver every man his soul. Be not cut off in her iniquity, for this is the time of the Lord's vengeance, and he will render unto her a recompense. So they need to flee out of the city. They need to become refugees, to flee away before the invading armies got there, because those invading armies were going to be victorious. In question 12, what does Jeremiah point out concerning the differences between the Lord and the idols? Well, here in chapter 51, and going to verse 17, it says, Every man is brutish by his knowledge. Every founder is confounded by the graven image. For his molten image is falsehood, and there is no breath in them. They are vanity, the work of errors. In the time of their visitation they shall perish. The portion of Jacob is not like them, for he is the former of all things, and Israel is the rod of his inheritance. The Lord of hosts is his name. Here the point is made that the idols that Babylon worshiped were just worthless images. They had no breath. They could not move around, and they could not provide deliverance for the Babylonians. But the God of Jacob was far more powerful. He is alive. He is the creator of heaven and earth. He is the former of all things, and he would deliver his people. In question 13, list some of the things that God will do with Babylon, his battle axe. Well, if we look here at more of that imagery, he talks about them being a battle axe, and he says in verse 20, With thee I will destroy kingdoms. And certainly the Babylonians did destroy one nation after another, and we've read the prophecies of that going through the book of Jeremiah. In verse 21, And with thee I will break in pieces the horse and his rider, and with thee I will break in pieces the chariot and his rider. In other words, this battle axe will also defeat all of the armies that come up against her. Then in verse 22, With thee also I will break in pieces man and woman, and with thee I will break in pieces old and young, and with thee will I break in pieces the young man and the maid, and I will also break in pieces with thee the shepherd and his flock, and with thee I will break in pieces the husbandman and his yoke of oxen, and with thee will I break in pieces captains and rulers. In other words, the Babylonians are going to destroy communities and uproot people. Those leaders and those relationships are going to be severed. But he's also going to destroy their commerce and the captains of the rulers. It's going to be a complete devastation that God's going to render through this battle axe of the Babylonians. In question 14, God used the attitude of the Babylonians for his purposes, but did this exonerate them from being guilty of desiring to crush nations? In other words, their power kind of went to their head. They became sometimes overly aggressive and overly vengeful of the nations that they destroyed. Here in verse 24 of the 51st chapter, and I will render unto Babylon and to all the inhabitants of Chaldea all their evil that they have done in Zion in your sight, saith the Lord. They were not going to get off the hook just because of God using them as his tool. They will pay for their vengeance. In question 15, what does Jeremiah say about blood? Well, going down to verse 35, it says, the violence done to me in my flesh be upon Babylon. Shall the inhabitant of Zion say, and my blood upon the inhabitants of Chaldea shall Jerusalem say. Now, blood, as we go to some of the other passages, Numbers 35 and others, the shedding of blood needed to be redeemed by the shedding of blood, or cleansed by the shedding of the blood of the aggressor. And so the bloodshed of the Jews would be avenged by the bloodshed of the Babylonians whenever God visited his wrath upon them. Question 16 says, what are the exiles to call to mind? Here in chapter 51 and going to verse 50. Ye that have escaped the sword, go away and stand not still. Remember the Lord afar off, and let Jerusalem come into your mind. You need to think of what has happened to Jerusalem and happened in your past, the deaths caused by the Babylonians. But now it is your time to start setting your affections on going back home, and eventually that release will occur. In question 17, what was the symbolic act that Jeremiah instructed Seraiah to perform in Babylon, and what was its meaning? Well, here in chapter 51, and beginning in verse 59, we find that Jeremiah writes a book, and notice what's to be done with that book. This is the word which Jeremiah the prophet commanded Seraiah, the son of Neriah, the son of Mesalah, when he went with Zedekiah the king of Judah into Babylon in the 4th year of his reign, and that Seraiah was a quiet prince. So Jeremiah wrote a book of all the evil that should come upon Babylon, even all these words that are written against Babylon. And Jeremiah said to Seraiah, when thou comest to Babylon and shalt see, thou shalt read all of these words. And thou shalt say, O Lord, thou hast spoken against this place, to cut it off, that none shall remain in it, neither man nor beast, but it shall be desolate forever. And it shall be that when thou hast made an end of reading this book, that thou shalt bind a stone to it, and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates. And thou shalt say, thus shall Babylon sink, and shall not rise from the evil that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. So Seraiah was to take this book of prophecy written by Jeremiah, read it, and then tie a stone to it, and throw it into the Euphrates River. Now, in chapter 52, we find that the historic references are given. It's kind of an appendix here in this last chapter to what happened with the fall of Jerusalem. It's a rehearsal of all those things that we've talked about in the end of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. It's a rehashing of the story of what happened as Zedekiah and his army tried to flee out of the city of Jerusalem, but they were captured by Nebuchadnezzar. Zedekiah saw all of his sons killed before his eyes. Then his eyes were put out, and he was led in chains back to Babylon. And of course, then we have the great destruction of the city of Jerusalem and all of the things that the Babylonians did to that city. In question 19, it says, give the details of the plunder of the city and the temple. Well, in verse 13, it talks about how they burned the temple. They burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and all the houses of the great men burned he with fire. In verse 14, they broke down the walls of Jerusalem as well. And all the army of the Chaldeans that were with the captain of the guard brake down all the walls of Jerusalem round about. And then, of course, they carried away a massive number of captives. Continuing in verse 15, then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive certain of the poor of the people, and the residue of the people that remained in the city, and those that fell away, that fell to the king of Babylon, and the rest of the multitude. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left certain of the poor of the land for wine dressers and husbandmen. And then, for the next several verses, it talks about the stripping of the temple of anything of value. Various utensils that were there, all the brass coverings, anything of value that was found in the temple, it was all taken away and carried back to Babylon as part of the plunder of the city. And then finally, in question 20, it said, give the names of the kings mentioned in Jeremiah 52 in these last three verses and tell what is said of them. Well, beginning in verse 31, it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, in the 12th month, in the 5th and 20th day of the month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, lifted up the head of Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, and brought him forth out of the prison. Now, Jehoiachin had been named as a king that had been taken or somewhat surrendered to the Babylonians, and he was carried back to Babylon as a captive. But one of the later kings in Babylon brought him out of his captivity and gave him honor. He treated him well. In verse 32, he spake kindly unto him, and set his throne above the throne of the kings that were with him in Babylon, and changed his prison garments. And he did continually eat bread before him all the days of his life. And for his diet there was a continual diet given him of the king of Babylon, every day a portion until the day of his death, all the days of his life. So Jehoiachin was treated respectfully before he died, as he was carried back away to Babylon. But such was not the case for Zedekiah. He died in prison as a result of his rebellion. So here we complete the work of Jeremiah in his book of prophecy. Next week we'll be looking at his writings in Lamentation. But as we look here to Jeremiah's writings, we see him talking about what was going to happen to Judah because of their iniquity. The predictions are given, the prophecies are fulfilled. The warning is given for the remnant not to flee to Egypt. They do anyway, and also the consolation is given as to what's going to happen to them for their disobedience. But then we find throughout all of this that God keeps giving through the mouth of Jeremiah the prophet the warning that one day there is an encouraging sign that in the latter times a kingdom would be restored, and that would be the spiritual kingdom established by Jesus Christ. That kingdom that comes as a result of the stone that broke the image that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about. It becomes a kingdom that consumes all of these kingdoms. It's that everlasting kingdom, the spiritual kingdom, the church that was established on the day of Pentecost. We find Jesus reigning even today over this spiritual kingdom. So Jeremiah helps us to see in great detail the whys and wherefores of the destruction of many nations, that wickedness is punished, and God does not let it go unpunished. And we find here the promise given to the faithful that God will not desert his people. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the study in Jeremiah, and next week we will continue looking at his writings as we look at the book of Lamentations. Thank you for joining us.